were initially sent to Liberia to worry about mathematics, not about literacy. And mathematics is in some ways an easier target because it's a well-structured domain. Used by Lave later, used by a number of people. So, and in that work, we found a fairly large impact of years of schooling on the way in which people dealt with a large variety of psychological tasks, right? So even though we were focused initially on mathematics, when we went back, we broadened our profile to try to look at what we thought of as cognitive processes more generally within an American experimental psychology learning theory framework. So there wasn't, in our work, there wasn't Piaget, for example. They were all sort of learning experiments. Why are these kids not doing well in school? They're not learning in school, so let's go look at learning. And when we gave this sort of wide array of different kinds of tasks, we found for very many of them a very marked impact of schooling on performance. So this is like what Luria found in a different way with Central Asia, a little bit different way of life for people, but in Liberia, you could really get schooling without collectivization and a lot of the other stuff. There is connections with the government, but it's not. So it's a different situation. You do cross-cultural work, so you go and you study schooling there, and then the question arises: well, what is it about schooling? Right. Well, I mean, how do we understand this? So one line of work which gets picked up later is, well, the tasks themselves may be so unrepresentative of the way in which these people experience the issue that you're trying to raise that the effect of schooling is just basically to teach ways of responding in a situation. It's it's a framing effect. These people could do it if you frame the problem correctly to them in their terms, not in somebody else's terms that they haven't experienced before. That's one explanation. The other explanation is these are really kind of real effects and they're associated with literacy. And at the time, there was the writings of Vygotsky on the impact of writing on development and likening it in some ways to second language learning, giving you an external prop to think about language, a tool itself to think about language. So you have this kind of confounded thing where, yes, there are these developmental changes with age. They depend upon schooling, but schooling is a massively packaged variable. So how could you break it apart? And so that's what led to the work that we subsequently did in Africa, focused directly on literacy versus schooling, because we were able to find this group of people who had invented, under their own historical circumstances, a written language that was used by roughly 20% of the men in the society, maybe more, and some small percentage of the women. And so we could sort of do our psychological test, so to speak, using school literacy or schooling versus VI literacy, this the VI people. And we also had people who in my country who were Muslim, so there were people who were literate in some sense in the Quran. All right, so you had these sort of different ways in which print mediated human activity. There, we kind of got, that pushed us back. Just as the work had done in mathematics, we kept asking, well, let's go back to what people do in their everyday life that involves things that we call mathematics as a starting point for our analysis to understand the pattern that we see. We did the same thing with literacy, saying, wait, there are these literate practices. Let's go and let's model our experiments kind of around the way in which people actually do things, around indigenous practices of literacy, and not just school practices of literacy. Same thing for Quranic literacy. And when we did that, we were then pushed back again to saying, well, wait a second. If we if we test people who are literate in this language, and they do something in that language that is a practice of, like record keeping, like letter writing was a big thing using text, that we should be able to look at something like letter writing, or to take tasks that required them to communicate in some way to show that there's an impact of literacy. And if you brought your task close enough to the indigenous kinds of uses, sure enough, the indigenous people were better at doing that than non-literate people, and even sometimes better than schooled people. They were better at analyzing language in terms of syllables because their writing system and their language was highly syllabic. There's a tonal language where you can use syllables in our system. So those things mesh together with the problem with ecological validity of what do your experiments measure, how is it related to the everyday lives of people, and then this question about, well, what is it that promotes literacy, and what does literacy promote? Now, all of this, the first part of all of this was done before I went to Rockefeller. At Rockefeller, I was contacted by Sylvia Scribner, who was looking for a postdoc. And she had written this essay on Vygotsky and writing. And so I took her in as a postdoc. But she really wanted to do research in Africa. So I arranged for her to go and do replication studies of stuff we had done among the Pella people. And she came back and was fired up to do a real serious project on the Vai. And so I agreed sort of as she took the lead, because I was at a point in my family life where it was quite difficult for me to take, and I also had a lot of other responsibilities for other research in New York, and that's what leads into the research with Mal, and just I'm balancing a lot of, I'm sorry, I'm balancing a lot of pieces here.
She took a lead, you said, because you had some other responsibilities, right?
Right. So, I mean, there are other projects that I had to engage in, and Sylvia took the lead in that. But in doing it, you know, we did it in 3 phases. We first said, well, literacy doesn't require schooling, but what's it related to? So we did this giant sociological survey that included stuff on modernity, included any variable that anybody could have thought of. And it included a set of psychological tasks as part of it, ones that had shown effects of schooling before. So we did, that sort of was like getting a landmark. What is literacy related to? And it's related, you know, weakly to, strongly to gender because it's male dominated. But there are weak relationships, the amount of travel and knowing other languages and having lived in cities and so on. But we then didn't see much in terms of the effects of literacy one way or another on these psychological tasks. So that's strange. So there's a schooling effect, but apparently no literacy effect on those tasks. So you have, then it's what's special about schooling, but then doesn't literacy make any difference at all to cognitive tasks? So then we did a second round of research where we focused particularly on language-related skills, so-called meta-linguistic survey, where we had another set of tasks, now much more focused on the language, literacy, cognition sort of nexus. And in those, we also very rarely showed important effects. We could show some effects, for example, we manipulated stuff on syllogistic reasoning, but in general, it was quite disappointing. There were no generalized effects of knowing biliteracy on these metacognitive skills, apparently. Again, there's a problem with the ecological validity of the task. And then finally, we started to do tasks that actually modeled things that people really do, like letter writing. There's a little lotto board game we used that had people play and then have to explain it to somebody else. So we had a number of these. We had a writing task where we took pictures and people had to translate those pictures into sounds and then interpret what the sentences said. Things like that, right around the writing task. And there we definitely got the effects that where we could show that the practice of letter writing, for example, had a significant effect on performance in pretty well-controlled experimental tasks. But they're quite specific effects. So that, I mean, that led us into trying to talk about the extent to which the degree of generality of the effects of literacy depend critically upon the range of contexts, the range of activities in everyday life where you have to use it. And if you only use it in very narrow circumstances, then it has narrow effects. If you use it in broader circumstances, it can have broader effects. Just how broad, people argue, and why. But then in moving to New York and in starting up the laboratory, it was very clear that if I wanted to take the lessons of what it was that we had done in Liberia, a large part of it was the centrality of indigenous knowledge in trying to organize comparison. You really had to take it seriously. And that meant working with people of color in New York City. And there initially it was with African-American colleagues. That work started to explore the way in which, very much like the experimental work that we had done before, issues of vocabulary, issues of the task setting, and so on performance. And found some of the same kinds of results that we had found in Africa. But simultaneously, we were doing work on this problem of ecological validity. And there we were, that work led us, and I could discuss that totally separately, but that work led us to the discovery that we had in our sample, in the group of children that we were working with in several different settings, that we had a kid who the teacher described as learning disabled and who had a lot of trouble with reading. And so it's like the literacy stuff was coming at us from several different directions. And this learning disabled kid really got us interested because in our after school clubs, we didn't know that he couldn't read. And we had to start looking very carefully and arranging the situation, creating discontinuities to externalize all the work he was doing to not have to read, and be able to engage with the other kids in the task. So that focused us really on the problem of these kids were having a lot of difficulty learning to read. We come at that, and that's where the research got to. And that's a whole line of research that would require a special discussion. That's at Rockefeller. But we're following now the literacy thread. And when we get to New York, I mean, we leave New York and we come to California, one of the people who was with us was Louis Mall, who's been a postdoc back in New York. And he'd been reading Vygotsky, and he was really interested in problems of bilingual education and bilingual literacy. So it was natural enough. We'd done all this work on literacy and culture, and Luis himself, we put him in contact with a foundation that supported the work here in California that he and Esteban Diaz were the principal investigators of. And there, I mean, the basic story there is that they were working with bilingual children.
Yes.
And they had to be bilingual in order to be in the school. And then they studied a Spanish reading class, literacy class, or reading instruction class in the morning in Spanish, and in English in the afternoon. And they discovered just by observation that children who could read and speak Spanish perfectly well were answering comprehension. These are like 4th, 5th graders. We're answering comprehension questions, and we're reading for meaning. When you took the same kids over to the English class, where they speak English, at least English that they've learned at home and on the street, their reading lesson is at the level of teaching them phonics. And you're going, wait a second, how can it be that the children can speak English and Spanish, can read Spanish, but they have to be taught phonics in English? And it's like, we really got into Vygotskian theory here because, and the forms of mediation that were sort of constructed for the kids by the teacher, and language ideologies. And there was this notion of unmediated to mediated as level 1 versus level 2 kinds of learning. They coincided with ideas of Arthur Jensen about racial differences in intelligence, where there's a level 1 that's kind of rote learning, and then there's a level 2, which is more complicated, mediated kinds of thought. And the way we analyzed it was that the teacher believed that he had to be able to pronounce the phonics, in the phonics lessons, had to be able to pronounce the letters of the alphabet correctly before you went on to comprehension. But the kid spoke with an accent. So he didn't speak Spanish. So he couldn't tell. His ideology was, first they have to get this right, then we go on to the other stuff. Mm-hmm. And they were having trouble getting it right, not because they couldn't read, but because they couldn't pronounce it correctly. Mm-hmm. So the way in which Luis and Esteban entered into this was they initially went and had created lessons with the agreement of the teachers. That they went into the English language classroom, and they had the kids read a passage in English and then talk about the passage in any combination of languages they wanted.
Yes.
And ask questions about it. Yeah. And that showed that when you freed up the oral demands on the kids to say it with the right grammar and the right accent, that they understood what they were reading. Mm-hmm. They were having difficulty expressing it because of the very narrow constrictions that the English language teacher put on them. They couldn't show that they could comprehend because the lesson didn't allow them to do that. And then they went on and actually reorganized the classroom and did this sort of bilingual stuff and showed these kids, I mean, they could read. The problem was that they needed bilingual teachers to teach them because their English language skills were not great. And you really, they sort of had to get past this idea of decoding before comprehension, because they could decode. It's just the whole context, we would have said at the time, is set up so that nobody knows what's going on. Mm-hmm. And it's even institutionally the case that nobody knows what's going on because the teacher in the morning in Spanish was not there in the afternoon and didn't know the teacher who taught in English, who didn't know what was going on. So when the researchers showed the teachers what was going on, the teachers were flabbergasted. They were very upset. Right? Each of them in their own way, mm-hmm. could see, the Spanish teachers say, my kids are being like just completely, miseducated here in this English classroom. And the English language teacher could see that there really was a problem. These kids knew a lot more than he understood they knew, but he couldn't do the bilingual mm-hmm. stuff to get it out. So I think that once you bring it into the American context, literacy is really fundamental to the problems that we were sort of assigned of dealing with, why is there this continuing gap between minority group kids, poor minority group kids, and middle-class Anglo kids, the so-called achievement gap, which we read about every year. And, this goes back to the history of the lab, where the lab formed because there were various institutions, both in the NIH and NSF, but also Carnegie these foundations sort of interested in education and worried about the fact that following Brown versus Board of Education, end of segregation, end of achievement gap, nothing of the sort, which is what led, to the whole push on sort of racial explanations from Jensen, but also then generated all the critique of both the forms of schooling mm-hmm. and then the deep hole that these poor kids speaking a second language are in when they walk into the standard American classroom. where the teacher does most of the talking and the kids do yes or no answers, and it's the worst environment in the world for learning the language. So that literacy then became just enmeshed in everything we did. And then later on, when we started to work with computers again, we were very, our push on communicating with a wizard or communicating at a distance with kids in faraway places, or internally when kids played edutainment games or educational software or arcade games, it was always within a larger structure, such that advancing within that structure required you to step back and think about what you're doing, communicate it to somebody else, write down a good hint to put it into the encyclopedia of hints so that newcomers who came in, a sort of communal knowledge building community. So that literacy was all, and numeracy of various kinds were all over the fifth dimension. So there's this then, it's a kind of constant thread because of really the starting point of saying, why are these children in the jungles of Africa having so much trouble when they enter school? I mean, what is that about? And so the inequalities in educational performance, it remains like a big problem, and it's related to charter schools are disgusted with the public schools. But the public schools are part of the problem. And their structure and the financial structure of education in the United States is just a part of creating, it's both a booster, it's a route to social class mobility, but it's also, for most children, it's an enormous barrier to social class mobility. And that sort of stuff starts before birth. It starts with the employment of the parents, what kind of health care plan you have, what the food is that you can get for the kids, and so on and so forth. So then that's really ties up with the overall lab, concern with the social creation of social inequality. I mean, it's society that's creating the conditions that create the social inequality is the problem that people moan about. So that's it on literacy. I mean,
I really appreciate you keeping this thread, because it does seem to me, that's the reason I ask you, that what you just said, that you can't, as a researcher, just have, say, something like effect of schooling, right? When you and Sylvia unpack that it could be different type of schooling, different type of
right.
And that leads to the different consequences, that you have to be much more nuanced into analyzing that.
Now we would say, with work that Greenfield has done and Keller and others in the culture and development thing, that you're putting kids on different different life trajectories.
Yes.
Right.
And this kid with disability, the one which also brought a lot of thinking for you, it's the same theoretical idea, right? That you have to really unpack all these nuances before you make this broad brushed sort of a conclusion of, I don't know, something like, strong effect of literacy on cognitive development. And you don't ask which literacy, in which context. And all other questions you started to be, more sensitive to after you did the VAE, right, experiment.
That's correct. I mean, starting with the very first, work in West Africa, you just get really sensitive to that sort of thing. And you run into occasions, which, I mean, many people have reported this sort of thing, where they're dealing with somebody who's not literate and probably doesn't know English, and this goes way back in the history of psychology, and they just do things, that, like, you just wonder, like, how do they do that? Like, I can't. They'll look over and point at something and point out something to you, and you look and you go, what? I don't see that. And they have some of the same reactions to stuff that, things that we take for granted. So, for example, if you live in the jungles of Liberia, it's jungle. And there are clearings in the jungle, but around the clearings in the jungle, it's jungle. And so if you're on the ground and there's no mountains to speak of, if you're on the ground, you never see very far. they maybe a few hundred yards, something like that, but 2 miles in like uninterrupted view of, say, a person or something a couple of miles away, very rare experience. And I took one of the young schoolboys who worked with us, and I took him down to Monrovia, where there is a tall hill in Monrovia, and it's on the ocean. And it's outside a harbor, so there are these very large container ships, oil tankers, and they carried lead, iron ore out of there. So iron ore ships going out, huge tanker ships. And the young man I was with looked out there and said, "Wow, why do those people go out there in those little tiny boats?" Right? So, right, because the retinal image is very small, and he has no frame for seeing.
Yeah.
We see them as large when they're not on the retinal image because of our knowledge of both the ships and our experience in.
Yeah, that's Gibson, right?
Yes, Gibson.
Yeah. Interesting example, but yeah, interesting.
Right. So when that happens, it shakes your belief that the psychological tests that you give, of the generality of the conclusions that you can draw from them. And in terms of policy, if you make the wrong, you have the wrong diagnosis and you start treating it, you cause a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in medicine, it's like when you go to a hospital, it's dangerous because there are all of these things around. You can get diseases in hospitals that you can't get anywhere else. There's an English word for that, or from Greek or something, an iatrogenic disease. It's caused by the treatment. And a lot of what educators do is they cause problems by their goodwill to treatment and their beliefs about how it should go.
Yes. Did you know that Luria taught us about the heterogenic behavior of neuropsychologists? We actually had the warning, like Homsky taught the course, but we discussed that a lot from Luria. Be careful what you impose into situation.
Yeah, but he himself, that's my gripe with his work in West Africa, is that he overgeneralized what it was that he was doing. I think Tulvista really had the way, a way of thinking about it, that there are historically new forms of activity arise, and that you will have higher psychological functions associated with those forms of activity, including mediated by print. And I mean, I'm very happy with that. The problem is, all of the places where, as a result of over-relying on print mediation, you're stupid because it's not appropriate, and you don't understand that you're overgeneralizing your own educated ways of trying to think about that. So, but that, so there's a bracketed sense in which, of course, there are higher psychological functions, and there are more complex higher psychological functions and systems of psychological functions, and not everybody can be an atomic physicist, right? It's just like all of that is true, and we know that there's this kind of hierarchy of the thing. But there are a lot of atomic physicists who are really stupid people walking around the world in a lot of other ways. And it's like, so why is it that you only count one? So that, anyway, I don't think that's a good way to do psychology in general. It's just more of ideology, kind of applied ideology. Until you bring it back into evolutionary theory and say, well, human beings survive by the way in which they transform their environments, and they do that through what we call technology. And therefore, you select for people who are good at the technologies. But then you have to have people who are good at creating the institutions that will coordinate the use of those technologies